The Winchester felt heavier today. Eleanor Reed ran the cloth along the barrel one more time, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the stock with familiar precision. 5 years hadn't dulled the sheen of the metal, nor had it dulled the pain that lived in her chest. She'd kept Gabriel's rifle as pristine as the day he'd last held it, as if preserving the weapon might somehow preserve a piece of him too. Outside, the Nebraska wind howled across the plains, a mournful sound that matched the emptiness within her. Dust particles danced in the shafts of late afternoon light that cut through the cabin's small windows. They were the only things that moved freely in this tomb of a home. Eleanor placed the rifle across her lap and reached for the paper and pencil she'd set on the table. The date at the top of the page seemed to mock her: April 17th, 1878. 5 years to the day since the fever had taken Gabriel and their unborn child. Her hand barely trembled as she wrote, "My dearest Gabriel, I'm coming to you today. I've tried to live in this world without you, but it's a half-life, a shadow existence. The land yields nothing but dust and memory. I'm tired of waking to silence, of speaking to ghosts. Forgive me for what I'm about to do, or perhaps thank me, for soon we'll be together again. You and I and the child we never met. Until moments from now, your Eleanor." She folded the letter carefully, precisely, and placed it beside the photograph of Gabriel in his Union Army uniform. His eyes, deep blue and kind, even in the serious pose demanded by the photographer, seemed to watch her as she picked up the rifle again. Eleanor checked that it was loaded, though she knew it was. She'd loaded it this morning with hands that had once been steady enough to stitch wounds under cannon fire. She pressed the cold metal beneath her chin and closed her eyes. The sharp knock at the door startled her so badly that she nearly pulled the trigger by accident. "Mrs. Reed, you in there? Sheriff Cooper?" Eleanor lowered the rifle with a shuddering breath and quickly slid it under the table. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her simple black dress before opening the door. The sheriff stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable as he always did when visiting her homestead. A tall man with a heavy mustache and kind eyes that reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Afternoon, Mrs. Reed," he said, nodding respectfully. "Sheriff," she replied, her voice rough from disuse. How long had it been since she had spoken aloud to another person? Weeks, perhaps. "I thought you should know there's an auction in town today. Foster's Mill Properties." "And why would that interest me?" Her tone was flat, disinterested. Cooper looked even more uncomfortable. "Well, I know you sometimes attend these things, and—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to articulate why he thought she frequented such events. He wasn't wrong. Eleanor often went to auctions and foreclosures not to purchase, but to witness, to see other lives dismantled, piece by piece, as if watching others' losses might somehow validate her own. It was a bitter communion with grief that she couldn't explain to anyone, least of all this kind but simple lawman. "Foster died owing a lot of people," Cooper continued. "Everything's going under the hammer. Even his workers." Eleanor's attention sharpened at this. Workers, 3 women, sisters. They were indentured to him. Cooper looked down at his boots. "They're all in a family way." The words landed like stones in still water. 3 pregnant women being sold like cattle. For a moment, Eleanor felt something pierce through the protective numbness she'd cultivated for 5 years. Something hot and sharp that might have been anger or purpose. "The auction starts in an hour," Cooper said, replacing his hat. "Just thought you might want to know." After he left, Eleanor stood motionless in the doorway, the suicide note on the table behind her momentarily forgotten. She turned and looked at the rifle, then at Gabriel's photograph. His eyes seemed different now, not just watching, but waiting. The auction was held in the dusty yard behind what had once been Foster's mill. A crowd of men gathered in the relentless sun, their faces shining with sweat, their expressions ranging from boredom to predatory interest. The auctioneer, a wiry man with yellow teeth, stood on a makeshift platform calling out items and accepting bids, in a voice that grated on Eleanor's nerves. She stood at the back, a black silhouette against the weathered fence. No one approached her or acknowledged her presence. The widow Reed was a ghost among the living, a curiosity best left undisturbed. The mill equipment went first, then Foster's wagon and horses. Each item represented another piece of a life dismantled. Eleanor watched with detached interest until the auctioneer called for the next lot. "And now, gentlemen, Foster's final assets. Three women were led onto the platform. They stood close together, hands bound loosely before them with coarse rope. The eldest, perhaps in her mid-20s, held her chin high despite the fear evident in her rigid posture. The middle sister kept her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller. The youngest couldn't have been more than 19, her delicate features tight with terror, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. The foster workers, the auctioneer announced, Rebecca, Lydia, and Hannah, all three carrying, as you can see. He gestured dismissively at their rounded abdomens. Liabilities, some might say, but others might see opportunity. Their indenture papers have 4 years remaining. A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor felt her heart rate quicken. The eldest sister, Rebecca, scanned the crowd with defiant eyes that suddenly startlingly locked with Eleanor's own. Something in those eyes struck Eleanor like a physical blow. They were a deep, vivid blue. Gabriel's eyes. "Who will start the bidding at $10, the auctioneer called. Silence answered him. The men looked away, shuffling their feet. No one wanted 3 pregnant women, 3 extra mouths to feed that would soon become 6. Then a voice cut through the uncomfortable quiet. $10. Ezra Montgomery stepped forward, his tall frame impeccably dressed despite the frontier setting. The former Confederate officer had established himself as a powerful man in the region after the war, owning the bank and half the businesses in town. His silver hair and beard gave him a distinguished appearance that belied the coldness in his eyes. The sisters stiffened visibly at his bid. Eleanor saw fear flash across their faces, not the generalized fear of uncertainty, but the specific terror of recognition. They knew Montgomery and they feared him. $10 from Colonel Montgomery, the auctioneer announced, relief evident in his voice. Do I hear 15 times? The silence returned thicker this time. No one would bid against Montgomery. His influence in the town was too great, his retribution too certain. Eleanor found herself moving forward before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. $50, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Every head turned toward her. Whispers rippled through the crowd as men shifted to get a better look at the widow who had broken her long silence. Montgomery turned slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder as he recognized her. Mrs. Reed, he said, his deep South accent still pronounced after all these years. What possible use could you have for these women? Eleanor didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. $50, she repeated. Montgomery's face darkened. 75, he countered. 100, Eleanor responded immediately. The crowd's whispers grew louder. This was far more than 3 indentured pregnant women were worth in practical terms. Montgomery's eyes narrowed as he studied Eleanor, clearly trying to discern her motivation. 150, he said, a challenge in his voice. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. 200. It was everything she had, the entirety of her savings from 5 years of barely subsisting on her small farm. For a moment, she thought Montgomery would continue bidding out of pure spite, but after a tense silence, he gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Let the widow have them, he said, his voice carrying a promise of future reckoning. They'll be her ruin. The auctioneer, clearly eager to conclude this unexpected confrontation, brought his gavel down quickly. Sold to Mrs. Reed for $200. Eleanor approached the platform, aware of every eye following her movements. She paid the auctioneer from a small leather pouch, the coins heavy in her palm. Then she turned to the 3 sisters, who watched her with expressions caught between hope and dread. She pulled a small knife from her pocket, the one she used for mending harnesses, and cut through the ropes binding their wrists. She didn't speak. She simply turned and began walking out of the yard, expecting them to follow. As she passed Montgomery, he stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You've made a grave mistake today, Mrs. Reed. Your husband isn't here to protect you anymore. Eleanor looked up at him, meeting his gaze without flinching. I never needed his protection, she said quietly. I only wanted his company. She continued walking, feeling the sisters fall into step behind her. She could sense Montgomery's eyes boring into her back, could feel the weight of his hatred. But for the first time in 5 years, the crushing weight of her grief felt lighter, replaced by something sharper and more immediate. The journey to the homestead was silent and arduous. The 4 women walked the dusty road without speaking, the afternoon sun beating down on them mercilessly. Eleanor led the way, her pace steady and unhurried. The sisters followed a few steps behind, occasionally whispering among themselves. As they crested the final hill, the vast Nebraska sky opened above them, painted in watercolor strokes of blue, blue, and gold. Eleanor paused, gazing upward. For the first time in 5 years, she saw beauty in the world, instead of emptiness, not happiness, not yet, but a momentary suspension of pain that felt like taking a full breath after years of shallow ones. She glanced back at the three women following her, three lives she had inexplicably chosen to save, when hours ago she had been ready to end her own. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. Instead, she turned back to the horizon where her small farm came into view. It wasn't much a sturdy log cabin, a weathered barn, a corral, and a small vegetable garden that yielded barely enough to sustain one person. Everything was meticulously maintained, but lifeless, a monument to routine without purpose. "This is it," Eleanor said, her voice startling in the silence. "This is where you'll live and work until your indenture is complete." The three sisters looked at the homestead with expressions that mingled relief and apprehension. "Thank you, ma'am," Rebecca said, her voice stronger than her exhausted appearance suggested. "We're grateful for—" "I didn't buy you out of charity," Eleanor interrupted. "I need help with the farm. You'll earn your keep." She led them inside the cabin. It was a single room with a stone hearth, a sturdy table with 4 chairs, a bed in one corner, and a curtained-off area that presumably served as storage. "You'll sleep there," Eleanor said, pointing to the curtained space. "There are blankets. You can arrange it as you need to." She indicated the hearth and the small pantry beside it. "Food is there. Don't waste it. Water comes from the well outside. The privy is behind the barn." Her instructions were clipped and practical, devoid of warmth. "Questions?" The sisters exchanged glances. Lydia, the middle one, spoke hesitantly. What work will we be doing, ma'am?" "Whatever needs doing," Eleanor replied. "The garden needs tending. The cabin needs cleaning. The barn needs repair." "We can cook," Hannah, the youngest, offered quietly. "Good. You'll need those skills." Eleanor turned away from them and began removing items from the pantry to prepare a simple meal. "Yes, today. Work begins tomorrow." The sisters retreated to the curtained area, their whispers barely audible as they settled into their new space. Eleanor worked mechanically, trying to ignore the strange intrusion of life into her carefully maintained solitude. For 5 years she had lived alone with her grief, her daily routines as rigid and unchanging as the seasons. Now there were other heartbeats under her roof, other breaths disturbing the silence. As she prepared the evening meal, her eyes kept returning to the rifle propped in the corner. The rifle that would have ended her life if Cooper hadn't knocked on her door. The suicide note still lay on the table, folded and hidden beneath a book. She set out 4 plates for the first time since Gabriel died. The simple act felt sacrilegious somehow, as if she were betraying the sanctity of her grief. When she called the sisters to eat, they emerged cautiously from behind the curtain. They sat together on one side of the table, leaving Eleanor alone on the other. No one spoke as they ate the simple meal of beans and cornbread. The sisters ate hungrily but neatly, their manner suggesting they had known better circumstances before their indenture. As Rebecca reached for the water pitcher, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a small gold locket on her wrist. Eleanor noticed but said nothing. Yet as Rebecca poured water, the locket caught the light and Eleanor glimpsed what appeared to be a miniature portrait inside it. Something about the glimpsed face seemed oddly familiar. After the meal, as the sisters cleaned up, Eleanor sat on the porch with Gabriel's journal. She often read his entries in the evenings, a ritual of remembrance. Tonight she found herself unable to focus on the familiar words. Her mind kept returning to Rebecca's eyes, that impossible blue, and to the moment at the auction when she had outbid Montgomery. The colonel's hostility had been palpable. Gabriel had spoken of him occasionally during the war, always with a mixture of respect for his tactical skill and disgust for his cruelty. Their paths had crossed several times during the conflict, and Gabriel had once testified against Montgomery in a military inquiry about the treatment of prisoners. Eleanor had never told anyone in town about this connection. Nebraska was full of former soldiers from both sides trying to build new lives far from the battlefields of the East. The war was a closed book that no one wished to reopen. But Montgomery clearly remembered, and now she had publicly defied him. The sound of soft singing drew Eleanor from her thoughts. One of the sisters, Hannah, she thought was humming a gentle melody as they finished their chores. The simple tune floated through the cabin, achingly sweet in its normality. Eleanor closed the journal and went inside. The singing stopped abruptly as she entered. The sisters looked at her apprehensively as if expecting a rebuke. "I'll be up at dawn," Eleanor said, ignoring the sudden silence. "I expect you to be ready to work then." They nodded their understanding and she retreated to her bed in the corner of the cabin. She lay awake long after the sisters had settled behind their curtain, listening to the rhythm of their breathing in the darkness. Their presence felt like an invasion, disturbing the carefully preserved memorial she had made of her life. Yet as sleep finally began to claim her, Eleanor realized that for the first time in 5 years, she was looking forward to the morning. Dawn broke in streaks of gold and pink across the endless Nebraska sky. Eleanor was already up building a fire in the hearth when the sisters emerged from behind the curtain. They looked rested but wary, uncertain of what the day would bring. Eleanor nodded toward the pantry. "Make breakfast," she instructed. "Then we'll see what you can do." She went outside to feed the few chickens she kept and to check on her horse, leaving the sisters to manage the morning meal. When she returned, she found the table set and a pot of porridge bubbling on the hearth. Rebecca was kneading dough for bread, her movements practiced and efficient. They ate in the same silence as the night before, but this time Eleanor observed the sisters more carefully. Rebecca, the eldest, had an air of quiet authority. She was tall and straight-backed, despite her pregnancy, with strong hands and watchful eyes. Lydia, the middle sister, was more delicate in build, her movements hesitant, her gaze often downcast. There was a bruise fading on her cheek. Hannah, the youngest, had a softer quality to her, but Eleanor noticed how she studied the herbs hanging from the ceiling beams with keen interest. After breakfast, Eleanor assigned them tasks. Rebecca would help repair the chicken coop. Lydia would wash the accumulated laundry. Hannah would weed the struggling vegetable garden. "Can you use tools?" Eleanor asked Rebecca as they walked to the chicken coop. "Yes, ma'am," Rebecca replied. "Our father was a carpenter before—" She trailed off. "Before what?" Rebecca hesitated. "Before the war changed everything." Eleanor handed her a hammer. "The west wall needs reinforcing. The coyotes nearly got in last month." They worked side by side in silence, the rhythmic sound of their hammers filling the morning air. Rebecca was indeed skilled with tools, her movements sure and practiced. Occasionally, Eleanor caught her wincing and placing a hand on her swollen belly, but she never complained. "How far along are you?" Eleanor asked finally. "7 months, I think," Rebecca replied. "Lydia is about 6, Hannah 5. Eleanor nodded, not asking the obvious questions about the fathers. That wasn't her business. "You should rest when you need to," she said, her voice still matter-of-fact. "I need workers, not martyrs." Rebecca gave her a searching look. "Why did you buy us, Mrs. Reed, really?" Eleanor drove another nail into the wood with more force than necessary. "I told you, I need help with the farm." "You outbid Colonel Montgomery," Rebecca pressed. "That seems like more than just needing farmhands." Eleanor put down her hammer and turned to face Rebecca fully. "I know what men like Montgomery do to women like you," she said bluntly. "I was a nurse during the war. I've seen what happens to vulnerable people when predators have power." Rebecca's blue eyes, those unsettlingly familiar eyes, widened slightly. "You were a nurse in the Union Army." "Yes, that's how I met my husband." Eleanor picked up her hammer again, signaling the end of the conversation. "The coop won't fix itself." They resumed working, but Eleanor could feel Rebecca's gaze on her, periodically assessing and curious. It made her uncomfortable, as if the younger woman could somehow see past the barriers she had so carefully constructed round her heart. By midday, the homestead had taken on a different rhythm. Lydia had hung washing on the line the first time clothes had danced in the Nebraska wind at the Reed farm in years. Hannah had cleared half the garden of weeds and was carefully examining the struggling plants. The sound of women's voices, quiet conversations, occasional instructions broke the silence that had defined the place for so long. Eleanor retreated to the barn to check her supplies, needing a moment away from the strange transformation of her home. The familiar scent of hay and leather surrounded her as she counted sacks of grain and checked the condition of her tools. This was her routine, her control, the ordered existence she had created from the chaos of loss. "Mrs. Reed," Eleanor turned to find Lydia standing hesitantly in the barn doorway, a basket of folded laundry in her arms. "Where should I put these?" Lydia asked, her voice soft and uncertain. "On the shelf by the hearth," Eleanor replied. Lydia didn't move. She seemed to be gathering courage to speak further. I wanted to thank you, she said finally, for taking us in, for not separating us. Eleanor nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. You're welcome. Colonel Montgomery, Lydia began, then stopped, her face paling slightly. What about him? Eleanor prompted. Lydia shook her head. Nothing, I should finish the laundry. She turned to go, but Eleanor called after her. Lydia, what do you know about Montgomery? Lydia turned back slowly. He owns businesses in town, bad places. Before Mr. Foster bought our indenture, I worked in one of them. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. The places where women don't last long. Eleanor felt a cold anger settle in her chest. I see. She gestured to Lydia's bruised cheek. Did Foster do that to you? Lydia's hand went automatically to her face. No, Mr. Foster he wasn't kind, but he wasn't cruel either. This was from before. Eleanor nodded her understanding. Go put away the laundry, then rest. You're carrying a child. You shouldn't overexert yourself. After Lydia left, Eleanor remained in the barn processing this new information. If Lydia had worked in one of Montgomery's establishments, it explained the fear in the sisters' eyes when he had bid on them. It also confirmed Eleanor's instinct to intervene had been correct. She hadn't saved them out of compassion, at least that's what she told herself. She had acted on instinct, driven by some combination of her nurse's training and the strange pull she had felt when she saw Rebecca's eyes. It wasn't kindness. It was something else, something she wasn't ready to name. Eleanor emerged from the barn to find Hannah kneeling in the garden examining a plant with intense concentration. The youngest sister had removed her bonnet, and her dark hair fell forward, hiding her face. What are you doing? Eleanor asked. Hannah looked up startled. Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Reed. I was just looking at your herbs. She pointed to a scraggly plant. This yarrow is medicinal. My grandmother taught me that it can stop bleeding and fight infection. Eleanor stepped closer, intrigued despite herself. You know herbs. Hannah nodded, a flicker of animation crossing her features. My grandmother was a healer. She taught me what plants can heal and what plants can harm. She gestured to the garden. You have some good medicinal herbs here, though they need care. Show me, Eleanor said, surprising herself as much as Hannah. For the next hour, Hannah led Eleanor through the garden, pointing out plants and explaining their properties. The young woman's knowledge was impressive, her quiet voice gaining confidence as she spoke of her grandmother's teachings. Feverfew for headaches, comfrey for bones that won't heal, echinacea for fighting illness before it takes hold, Hannah explained. Grandmother said knowing plants is knowing life's secrets. Eleanor found herself remembering her own medical training, the frantic battlefield hospitals, where herbal remedies often supplemented dwindling medical supplies. Your grandmother was right, she said. During the war, herbs sometimes saved more lives than doctors. Hannah smiled for the first time since arriving at the homestead. It transformed her face, revealing dimples in her cheeks. You really were a nurse, she said. Rebecca mentioned it. I was for 3 years. That's why you have the medical books, Hannah said, nodding toward the cabin. Eleanor frowned. What medical books? On the high shelf behind the flour barrel. I saw them when we were making breakfast. Hannah's smile faded, replaced by worry. I'm sorry, I wasn't snooping. It's all right, Eleanor interrupted. You have good eyes. She had indeed kept her medical texts, though she rarely looked at them anymore. They were relics of another life, like Gabriel's rifle and journal. By late afternoon, the homestead had been transformed in small but significant ways. The chicken coop was repaired. Laundry hung on the line. The garden was half-weeded and assessed. Inside the cabin had been swept and dusted. The hearth cleaned, and bread was rising near the fire. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the setting sun paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The day's work had been productive, more so than any day in recent memory. The sisters had proven capable and diligent, despite their condition. And for the first time in 5 years, Eleanor had spent a day thinking of something besides her grief. She turned to go inside and found Rebecca standing in the doorway watching her. The locket Eleanor had noticed earlier glinted at her wrist. That's a beautiful piece, Eleanor said, nodding toward it. Rebecca's hand moved protectively to the locket. It was my mother's, the only thing I have left of her. May I see it? Rebecca hesitated, then slowly extended her wrist. Eleanor gently opened the small gold case. Inside was a miniature portrait of a man with a serious expression and familiar blue eyes, eyes that matched Rebecca's own. Eleanor's breath caught. The face was older than she remembered from Gabriel's few descriptions, but there was no mistaking the resemblance. "This is Joseph Reed," she said softly. Rebecca's eyes widened in shock. "How did you know?" "He was my father-in-law, Gabriel's father." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of a nighthawk. Rebecca's face had gone pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. Eleanor looked from the portrait to Rebecca's face, seeing now the resemblance she should have recognized immediately, the same high cheekbones, the same set of the jaw. "You're Gabriel's sister," Eleanor said, the realization dawning. "Half-sister, I'm guessing." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Different mothers. Our mother was Joseph's second wife after Gabriel's mother died. Gabriel was already grown and gone, by then joined the army before we were born. I don't think he even knew about us." Eleanor's mind raced trying to process this revelation. Gabriel had rarely spoken of his family, saying only that they had died or scattered during the war. He had been an only child, his mother dead of consumption when he was young. His father had remarried a woman he barely knew. "How did you end up here?" she managed to ask. "In Nebraska." Rebecca's fingers traced the outline of the locket. "When father died during the war, our mother tried to keep the family together, but it was hard. She fell ill. Before she died, she gave me this locket with father's picture inside. She made me promise to keep our family together." Rebecca called over her shoulder, "Lydia, Hannah, come out here." The other two sisters appeared in the doorway, their expressions wary. "Mrs. Reed is Gabriel Reed's widow," Rebecca told them, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Gabriel was our half-brother." Hannah gasped. Lydia's hand went to her mouth. "We're family," Eleanor said, the word strange on her tongue. "Gabriel was your half-brother. I'm your sister-in-law." Rebecca nodded. "When I saw you at the auction, I recognized you from the description Gabriel had written in his letters to father." She swallowed hard. "He wrote about his nurse wife with the healing hands and fierce heart. I knew it was you, but I wasn't sure you'd want to acknowledge us." "You knew who I was at the auction?" Eleanor asked, stunned by this revelation. "Yes," Rebecca admitted. "I was hoping you'd see the resemblance, that you'd help us, but I didn't expect you to buy our indenture." "I didn't know," Eleanor said numbly. "I didn't recognize the connection. I only knew that your eyes—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the implications. "Gabriel never knew about you. He would have searched for you if he had." "We tried to find him after the war," Hannah said. "But we had no address, no way to locate him. Then we heard from a returning soldier that Lieutenant Gabriel Reed had settled in Nebraska with his wife. We were trying to save enough to travel here when everything fell apart." Eleanor stood and walked to the shelf where she kept Gabriel's few possessions. She took down a wooden box and returned to the porch. From it, she removed a packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are from Gabriel, to me during the war," she said. "There's one where he mentions his father remarrying, but he never spoke of siblings." She sifted through the letters until she found the one she sought. "Here," she read aloud, "Father has remarried a younger woman named Elizabeth. I've not met her, being occupied with this war, but I hope she brings him happiness in his final years. I sometimes regret our estrangement, but the path I've chosen is the right one, even if he cannot see it." Eleanor looked up at the sisters. "He and his father disagreed about the war. Joseph didn't want Gabriel to fight for the Union." Rebecca nodded. "Father wasn't political, but he feared losing his only son. After Gabriel left, though, Father changed. He began supporting the Union cause quietly. That's how he met our mother. She was organizing supplies for Union soldiers." The revelation settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. All these years she had thought herself alone in the world, her only family connection severed with Gabriel's death. Now suddenly she had three sisters-in-law, soon to be three nieces or nephews. "Does Montgomery know about this connection?" she asked sharply. The sisters exchanged glances. "I don't think so," Rebecca said. "We never spoke of our family to anyone in town. It wasn't safe to advertise Union connections in some places, even after the war." Eleanor nodded, her mind working rapidly. "Good, let's keep it that way for now." She looked at each sister in turn. "This changes things, but it also makes our situation more dangerous. If Montgomery realizes you're connected to Gabriel, it will only strengthen his resolve against us." "What will we do?" Hannah asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her swollen belly. Eleanor's jaw set in a determined line. We continue as before. We work the farm, we stay alert, and we give Montgomery no reason to suspect our connection. She stood feeling more resolute than she had in years. These weren't just three random women she had saved on impulse. They were family Gabriel's blood. Protecting them wasn't just an act of defiance against Montgomery. It was an obligation to her husband's memory. Get some rest, she told the sisters. Tomorrow will be a long day. As the sisters went inside, Eleanor remained on the porch watching the last light fade from the western sky. The suicide note she had written that morning seemed like a relic from another lifetime. She couldn't recapture the despair that had driven her to place the rifle beneath her chin. She had been ready to die this morning. Now, against all odds, she had found a reason to live. A week passed then, too. The rhythms of the homestead shifted and expanded to accommodate its new inhabitants. Eleanor found herself rising each morning with purpose, rather than resignation, planning the day's work and monitoring the sisters' progress with their pregnancies. Rebecca had proven herself adept with tools and strategy, helping Eleanor reinforce the barn and devise more efficient ways to manage a small farm. Lydia, though still quiet and watchful, kept the cabin immaculate and had begun taking over the cooking, revealing a talent for making even the simplest ingredients taste better than Eleanor had managed in years. Hannah had transformed the neglected garden, coaxing life from the hard Nebraska soil and expanding her collection of medicinal herbs. The shift in Eleanor was more subtle but no less profound. The rigid routines that had defined her existence loosened. She found herself listening to the sisters' quiet conversations in the evenings, occasionally even joining them. She still read Gabriel's journal and letters, but the ritual felt different now, less like preservation of the dead and more like introduction to the living. The morning was bright and clear as Eleanor stood in the yard showing Rebecca how to sight along the barrel of Gabriel's Winchester. Keep both eyes open, she instructed. Most people think you should close one, but that narrows your field of vision. Rebecca adjusted her stance, her pregnancy making the posture awkward, but her hands were steady as they gripped the weapon. When did you learn to shoot? She asked, lining up the sights on an old tin can positioned on a fence post 50 yards away. Gabriel taught me during the war, Eleanor replied. He said a woman alone should know how to protect herself. Rebecca squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked and the can jumped from the post. Good, Eleanor nodded. Now reload. As Rebecca worked the lever action, Eleanor glanced toward the garden where Hannah was harvesting herbs with methodical precision. Lydia sat on the porch mending a shirt, her face tilted toward the sun, in a rare moment of relaxation. It struck Eleanor suddenly how easily they had slipped into this arrangement, how natural it felt to have these women in her life. It wasn't happiness exactly. The wound of Gabriel's loss was still too raw for that, but it was something close to contentment, a temporary reprieve from the relentless tide of grief. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Eleanor turned to see Sheriff Cooper riding toward the homestead, his expression grim. Rebecca immediately handed the rifle back to Eleanor, who checked that it was loaded before resting it against her shoulder in a casual but ready position. Morning, Sheriff, she called as he dismounted, trying to keep her voice neutral, despite the unease his appearance stirred in her chest. Mrs. Reed, Cooper nodded, removing his hat. His eyes flicked to the rifle, then to Rebecca, noting their position, but making no comment. Ladies, he added, acknowledging the sisters with a tip of his head. What brings you out this way? Eleanor asked. Cooper shifted uncomfortably. Thought you should know there's been talk in town about your new arrangement here. People should mind their own business. It's Montgomery making it his business, Cooper said, lowering his voice, though the others were still within earshot. He's been asking questions about your land deed, about whether you've kept up with property taxes. Eleanor felt a chill despite the warm morning. My papers are in order. Gabriel made sure of that before he died. Cooper nodded. I believe you, but Montgomery has ways of complicating things, especially for women alone. He glanced at the sisters, or women in difficult circumstances. I can handle Montgomery, Eleanor said firmly, though she felt a flicker of unease. Cooper studied her face for a moment. You know, you remind me of someone, he said unexpectedly. Can't quite place who, but there's something familiar about you. Eleanor stiffened. Was it possible he recognized the resemblance between her and the sisters? Did he somehow know about their connection to Gabriel? Is there anything else? Sheriff Cooper replaced his hat. Just be careful, Mrs. Reed. Montgomery doesn't forget a slight, and he's got reason to dislike you beyond the auction. What do you mean? Cooper mounted his horse before answering. Your husband, Lieutenant Gabriel Reed, he testified against Montgomery during the war, didn't he? Something about mistreatment of prisoners. Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face because Cooper nodded grimly. Small world, Mrs. Reed. Word gets around even years later, even out here. As he rode away, Eleanor remained in the yard processing this new complication. If Cooper knew about Gabriel's testimony against Montgomery, then Montgomery certainly remembered it too. Her bid at the auction hadn't just been a current affront, it had reopened an old wound. What did he want? Rebecca asked, coming to stand beside her. To warn us, Eleanor replied. Montgomery's been asking about our land. Why would he care about your property? Eleanor shook her head. I don't know, but I intend to find out. The next day dawned gray and threatening, heavy clouds hanging low over the prairie. Eleanor left Rebecca in charge of the homestead and rode into town, her mind churning with questions and plans. Kingston was a modest frontier town, one main street lined with wooden buildings, a few side streets with smaller establishments and homes. It had grown in the 5 years since Eleanor had first arrived with Gabriel, but it was still small enough that a woman traveling alone drew notice. She felt eyes on her as she tied her horse outside the sheriff's office. Women alone were uncommon enough in town. Women dressed in their best and looking purposeful were rarer still. Cooper looked up in surprise when she entered his office. He was alone, working on paperwork at his desk, and he stood quickly when he recognized her. Mrs. Reed, he said, removing his hat, though he was indoors. This is unexpected. I need your help, Sheriff, Eleanor said without preamble. I need to understand why Montgomery is so interested in my land. Cooper gestured to a chair across from his desk. This time Eleanor sat. I've been wondering that myself, Cooper admitted, settling back into his own chair. Your property isn't particularly valuable from what I can tell. Good water source with that creek, but there are plenty of creeks in the territory. Could it be simple revenge for Gabriel's testimony? Cooper shook his head. Montgomery's not the type to waste time and resources on something that doesn't benefit him directly. If he's looking at your land, there's profit in it somehow. A suspicion formed in Eleanor's mind. The creek, she said slowly. What if there's something in the creek? Cooper's expression shifted subtly. What kind of something? Gold. The word hung between them, charged with possibility. There have been rumors, Cooper admitted. Nothing confirmed, but enough to catch Montgomery's interest. Eleanor leaned forward. Have there been strikes in the area? Small ones. Nothing like California, but enough to make men dream. Cooper drummed his fingers on the desk thoughtfully. Your creek does run from the foothills. It's not impossible. Eleanor stood abruptly. I need to see the town's copy of my deed, and I need to know everything about Montgomery's recent activities. Cooper led her to the land office next door, where a clerk reluctantly allowed them to examine the town's copy of the Reed deed. Eleanor read it carefully, confirming what she already knew. The creek ran through her property, not along its edge. The southern boundary was marked by a line of cottonwood trees nearly a quarter-mile beyond the water. The deed is clear, she said to Cooper as they left the office. The creek is well within my property. Deeds can be challenged, Cooper said grimly, especially when gold is involved. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Then I need to confirm if there's gold on my land before Montgomery makes his next move. As they walked down the street, Cooper filled her in on Montgomery's recent activities, the men he'd been meeting with, including known prospectors and a mining engineer from Denver. The sudden increase in purchases of mining equipment arriving at his warehouse. The strangers in town asking questions about the Reed property. They were passing the bank, Montgomery's bank, when the door opened and the man himself emerged. He stopped short when he saw them, his expression shifting from surprise to cold calculation. Mrs. Reed, he said, his southern accent pronounced. A pleasure to see you in town, and with our good sheriff, no less. His eyes moved between them, assessing. Discussing matters of law, perhaps. Just being neighborly, Cooper replied easily. Mrs. Reed had business in town. Montgomery smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Indeed, business seems to be on everyone's mind these days. He turned to Eleanor. I trust your new acquisitions are settling in well. They're none of your concern, Eleanor said flatly. Oh, but they are, Montgomery countered softly. Everything in this town is my concern. You'd do well to remember that. Before Eleanor could respond, Montgomery tipped his hat and continued down the street, leaving a chill in his wake despite the warm spring air. "He's planning something," Cooper murmured, "and he's confident about it." Eleanor watched Montgomery's retreating figure. "Then we need to move quickly." The rain was falling steadily by the time Eleanor returned to the homestead. The sisters had clearly been watching for her emerging from the cabin as she approached. "What did you learn?" Rebecca asked, helping Eleanor unsaddle her horse. Inside, gathered around the table with steaming cups of Lydia's chicory coffee, Eleanor shared what she had discovered about Montgomery's interest in their land. "Gold," Hannah echoed, her eyes wide. "In our creek." "Possibly," Dana replied. "We need to find out for certain." "I might know something about that," Lydia said softly. All eyes turned to her in surprise. She rarely volunteered information. "When I worked for Montgomery," she continued, staring into her cup rather than meeting their eyes, "I overheard things. Men talk freely around women they don't respect." Her cheeks flushed with shame, but she continued. "Last year there was talk about gold being found in a creek south of town. Montgomery was very interested. He sent men to find the exact location." "My creek?" Eleanor asked. "I don't know if it's your creek specifically," Lydia replied, "but it would explain why he wants the land." The implications settled over the room like the gathering storm outside. If there was gold on her property, Montgomery would stop at nothing to acquire it. "We need to find out for certain," Eleanor said finally. "Tomorrow when the storm passes, we'll check the creek ourselves." The rest of the evening passed in tense silence. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the small cabin. Eleanor found herself repeatedly checking that the rifle was loaded and within reach, startling at every sound that might indicate riders approaching through the downpour. The sisters huddled near the hearth, whispering among themselves. Occasionally, Eleanor caught fragments of their conversation, concerns about Montgomery, about their futures, about the babies they carried. As the night deepened and the storm began to subside, Eleanor made a decision. "We should get some rest," she told the sisters. "Tomorrow will be a long day." The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the Nebraska sky washed clean of clouds. Eleanor rose early, her sleep having been fitful and filled with dreams of Gabriel and his unknown sisters. She found Rebecca already awake, sitting at the table with the Gabriel's journal open before her. "I hope you don't mind," Rebecca said, looking up as Eleanor approached. "I wanted to know my brother better." Eleanor should have felt invaded, protective of Gabriel's private thoughts. Instead, she felt a strange relief that someone else now carried a piece of his memory. "He would have loved knowing you," she said simply. After a simple breakfast, the four women made their way to the creek. The recent rain had swollen it beyond its banks, the water running swift and muddy over rocks and fallen branches. "We need to check where the water runs slowest," Eleanor explained, leading them downstream. "If there's gold, it would settle in the bends where the current weakens." They spent the morning examining the creek, looking for the telltale glint of yellow among the stones and sand. The work was wet and muddy, their skirts soon sodden and stained. Eleanor showed them how to pan for gold using a shallow tin dish from the kitchen, scooping sediment from the creek bed and swirling it carefully to separate heavier materials. By midday, they had found nothing but ordinary creek pebbles and silt. Eleanor was beginning to think Lydia had misheard or misunderstood the conversation she'd reported. "Let's try farther downstream," she suggested, wiping sweat from her brow. The spring sun was surprisingly warm, and all four women had removed their bonnets and rolled up their sleeves. They moved to where the creek made a sharp bend before leaving Eleanor's property. Here the water pulled deeper, creating a small, still eddy on the inner curve. Hannah, who had been quietly observant all morning, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Reed, look at the plants here." Eleanor turned to where the youngest sister was pointing. Along the bank grew a type of rush she hadn't noticed before, with distinctively pointed tips. "What about them?" she asked. "My grandmother called them gold pointers," Hannah explained. "They often grow where there are mineral deposits. The roots like the same conditions that gold does." Eleanor examined the plants with newest interest. "Show me where they're thickest." Hannah led her to a spot where the rushes grew in abundance. Eleanor knelt and began to dig into the bank, with her hands scooping mud and roots aside to reach the soil beneath. Rebecca joined her, using a stick to dig deeper. After several minutes of excavation, her stick struck something hard. "Rocks," she said disappointedly. "Let me see." Eleanor insisted, reaching into the hole. She pulled out a stone about the size of her palm caked with mud. She dipped it in the creek, washing away the dirt. As the water cleared the surface, they all gasped. Embedded in the gray rock were distinct veins of yellow, small but unmistakable. Gold, Lydia whispered, her eyes wide. Eleanor turned the rock in her hands, examining it from all angles. Not much in this piece, but if there's one, there could be more. She looked up at the sisters, her expression grave. This is why Montgomery wants our land. Rebecca's face hardened. What do we do now? Eleanor pocketed the rock and stood brushing mud from her skirt. Now we know what we're fighting for, and we make sure our claim is ironclad. As they continued examining the creek bank, Hannah wandered a few yards farther downstream. Eleanor watched her pause, then kneel to examine something on the ground. After a moment, Hannah looked up, her face pale. Mrs. Reed, she called, her voice wavering. I think you should see this. Eleanor joined her, followed by Rebecca and Lydia. Hannah pointed to what had caught her attention, a small piece of metal protruding from the eroded bank where the storm had washed away a layer of soil. Eleanor carefully brushed away more dirt, revealing a tarnished military button. As she continued to clear the area, more became visible, a scrap of blue fabric, then horrifyingly what appeared to be a human bone. Dear God, Rebecca breathed. Eleanor sat back on her heels, her mind racing. The storm must have uncovered it. Is it a grave? Lydia asked, her voice barely audible. More than one, I think, Eleanor replied grimly, scanning the area with new awareness. Now that she knew what to look for, she could see subtle depressions in the ground, places where the soil had settled differently. This could be a burial site. From the war, Rebecca asked. Eleanor shook her head. The war never came this far west. These are more recent. A terrible suspicion formed in her mind as she examined the button more closely. It bore the insignia of the Union Army, the same insignia that had been on Gabriel's uniform. Hannah, look for more of those rushes, she instructed. Lydia, Rebecca, help me check these other depressions. For the next hour, they carefully examined the area. They found evidence of at least 6 burial sites, all showing signs of hasty, shallow interment. In 2 locations, they uncovered more buttons and fabric scraps, all consistent with Union Army uniforms. These were soldiers, Eleanor said, finally standing to survey the grim discovery. Union soldiers buried here in secret. But how? Why? Hannah asked, her face drawn with distress. I think, Eleanor said slowly, we found the prisoners Montgomery was accused of mistreating during the war, the ones Gabriel testified about. She remembered fragments of what Gabriel had told her, captured Union soldiers who had disappeared under Montgomery's watch, reports of torture, of men worked to death in makeshift labor camps far from the main battlefields. Gabriel had been part of a patrol that discovered evidence of the atrocities, but by the time a formal inquiry was launched, the prisoners and their bodies had vanished. Montgomery brought them here, Rebecca realized, horror dawning on her face, to hide the evidence of what he'd done. And now he's desperate to get this land, Lydia added. Not just for the gold, but to keep this buried. Eleanor nodded grimly. If these bodies were discovered and identified as the missing prisoners, the case against him could be reopened even after all these years. That's why he was so angry when you bought us, Hannah said. He thought he could pressure Foster's heir into selling him the land, but then you intervened. And he recognized you as Gabriel's widow, Rebecca concluded, the wife of the main witness against him. Eleanor looked from the partially exposed remains to the gold-flecked rock still in her pocket. 2 reasons for Montgomery to want her land, one for greed, one for self-preservation. Both powerful motivators for a man like him. We need to document this, she decided, and we need to tell Cooper. The sun was beginning to set by the time they finished their grim work. They had carefully mapped the locations of the burial sites, collected samples of the soil and a few of the buttons as evidence, and covered the exposed remains with fresh earth out of respect for the dead. As they walked back to the cabin, Eleanor's mind raced with plans and contingencies. She had no doubt that Montgomery would move against them soon, especially if he suspected they had discovered either the gold or the bodies. What will we do? Hannah asked, echoing Eleanor's thoughts. First secure the homestead, Eleanor replied. Then I'll ride to town tomorrow to show Cooper what we found and file a mineral claim on the gold. That will legally establish our right to any gold on the property and bring official attention to the land, making it harder for Montgomery to act openly against us." "And if he doesn't care about acting openly?" Rebecca asked. Eleanor's hand moved unconsciously to the rifle she carried. "Then we'll be ready for him." As they approached the cabin, they saw a figure waiting on the porch. Eleanor immediately raised her rifle, pushing the sisters behind her with her free arm. "Who's there?" She called, her finger moving to the trigger. The figure stood slowly, hands raised to show they were empty. "It's Cooper, Mrs. Reed, just me." Eleanor lowered the rifle slightly but remained wary as they approached. Cooper stepped down from the porch to meet them, his expression grave. "I was beginning to worry," he said. "You've been gone all day." "What are you doing here, Sheriff?" Eleanor asked, not bothering to hide the suspicion in her voice. Cooper had been helpful, but his sudden appearance at her homestead, without warning, set off alarm bells. "I came to warn you," he replied. "Montgomery's been meeting with Judge Parker all afternoon. They were looking at property maps of the county, focusing on your section." He glanced at their mud-stained clothes and the rifle in Eleanor's hands. "But it seems you've been doing some investigating of your own." Eleanor hesitated, then made a decision. "You'd better come inside. We have something to show you." In the cabin, Eleanor spread their findings on the table: the gold-flecked rock, the tarnished buttons, their crude map of the burial sites. Cooper examined each item carefully, his expression growing darker by the moment. "Missing Union prisoners," he said when she finished explaining. "You believe Montgomery brought them here and buried them on your land. I think they were brought here while the land still belonged to the original homesteader, before Gabriel and I purchased it," Eleanor clarified. "The seller was eager to leave, took less than the land was worth. Now I wonder if Montgomery pressured him to go, then planned to buy it himself before anyone discovered what was hidden there." "But Gabriel got it first," Cooper mused. "That must have infuriated Montgomery. And now he wants it back, not just for the gold, but to keep his crimes buried," Rebecca added. Cooper picked up one of the buttons, turning it over in his fingers. His face had taken on an odd expression, part anger, part something else Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "Do you know what regiment this is from?" he asked quietly. Eleanor shook her head. "The insignia is worn. I can make out that it's Union, but not the specific unit." Cooper placed the button carefully back on the table. "It's the 8th Ohio Volunteer Infantry." His voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "I would know it anywhere." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. How? Cooper raised his eyes to meet hers, and in them, she saw a pain that mirrored her own. "Because I served with them," he said, "under the name Daniel Reed." The cabin fell silent. Eleanor stared at him, uncomprehending. "Reed," she finally managed. "As in?" "Gabriel Reed was my half-brother," Cooper, or rather Daniel, said softly. "Different mothers. My mother was Joseph Reed's sister-in-law. There was an indiscretion after Gabriel's mother died. Joseph married another woman quickly to cover the scandal, but I was born just 7 months after the wedding." Eleanor sank onto a chair, her mind reeling from the second familial revelation in less than a week. "Gabriel never mentioned you," she said weakly. "He didn't know about me until we met during the war. I was a private in his unit." Daniel smiled sadly. "The resemblance was noticed by others before we realized it ourselves. When we compared stories, we discovered the truth." "Why didn't he tell me?" Eleanor asked, feeling a stab of betrayal that Gabriel had kept such a secret. "He wanted to after the war," Daniel assured her. "He wrote to me about you often said you were the best person he had ever known, that you'd understand and welcome me as family." His voice caught. "But then he died," Eleanor finished hollowly. Daniel nodded. "I was stationed in Missouri when I got word. By the time I could get away, he was already gone. I didn't know how to approach you in your grief, claiming to be family you'd never heard of. So you became the sheriff here, watching over me from a distance." Eleanor said, not sure whether to feel comforted or manipulated by this revelation. "I promised Gabriel I'd look out for you if anything happened to him," Daniel said simply. "Being sheriff was the best way to do that without intruding on your life." Eleanor studied his face with new awareness. Now that she knew to look, she could see traces of Gabriel in his features, the shape of his brow, the set of his jaw. "Why tell me now?" she asked. "Because you're in danger," Daniel said gravely. "Real danger. And because I've seen a change in you these past weeks. Since these women came to your farm, you have come back to life. Gabriel would be glad of that." Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "These women, the sisters I bought at auction, they're also Gabriel's family. his half-sisters from his father's second marriage. Daniel's eyes widened in genuine shock. That can't be coincidence. No, Eleanor agreed. It seems Gabriel had more family than either of us knew. She stood feeling suddenly resolute, which gives me even more reason to protect what's ours. What do you intend to do? Daniel asked. First file that mineral claim, Eleanor said firmly, then prepare for whatever Montgomery has planned. She looked Daniel directly in the eyes. Will you help us as family? Daniel straightened, his expression solemn. I've been helping from the shadows for 5 years, Eleanor. It's time I did so openly. Rebecca, who had been quietly observing this exchange, suddenly spoke up. There's something else you should know. Her voice was hesitant but determined. About the burials by the creek. All eyes turned to her, but it was Lydia who stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. I know where they are, she said softly. All of them, not just the ones you found today. Eleanor stared at her in confusion. How could you possibly? Because I helped bury them, Lydia whispered, tears filling her eyes. When I worked for Montgomery before he sold my indenture to Foster, he made me help. Said a woman's hands were better for digging in soft earth without leaving marks. Said no one would suspect a woman of such work. Horror dawned on Eleanor's face as she realized what Lydia was saying. You were forced to bury murdered prisoners. Lydia nodded, a tear spilling down her cheek. 12 men in all. I can identify every grave. I can testify to what was done to them. Her voice broke. I've been carrying this secret for so long, afraid to tell anyone, afraid of what Montgomery would do if he knew I remembered. That's why he bid on us at the auction, Rebecca realized. Not just for other reasons, but because Lydia knows where the bodies are buried, literally. Eleanor moved to Lydia's side, taking the younger woman's hands in her own. You don't have to face this alone anymore. We're family now. All of us. Daniel stood, his expression grim but determined. This changes everything. With Lydia's testimony and the physical evidence, we can bring Montgomery to justice, not just stop him from taking your land. But it also makes our situation more dangerous, Eleanor cautioned. If Montgomery suspects Lydia knows what she knows, he'll stop at nothing to silence her, Daniel finished. We need to move quickly but carefully. As they discussed their plan for the following day, filing the mineral claim, documenting Lydia's testimony, gathering more evidence from the burial sites, Hannah suddenly gasped, pointing to something on the table. What is it? Eleanor asked. Hannah picked up Gabriel's journal, which she had been examining while the others talked. Look at this, she said, turning to a page near the back of the book. I don't think you've read this part. Eleanor took the journal, recognizing Gabriel's handwriting, but not the entry itself. It was dated just weeks before his death during the illness that would eventually claim him. I've written to Captain Monroe about Elizabeth's daughters, the entry began. He's promised to look for them when he returns to Ohio. I cannot bear the thought of my sisters growing up without family to protect them. Father would want me to find them despite our differences. If anything happens to me, Eleanor will welcome them, I know. She has a heart big enough for all the broken pieces of my family. Strange that Montgomery, of all people, has agreed to help. We've been enemies since the inquiry, but he seems genuinely moved by my concern for my sisters. Perhaps there is still some humanity in him after all. He's promised to make inquiries through his business connections in the Midwest. I pray this is not another of his deceptions. Eleanor looked up from the page, stunned. Gabriel knew, she whispered. He knew about his sisters, and he asked Montgomery to help find them. Montgomery, Daniel echoed in disbelief. Why would Gabriel trust him after what happened during the war? He was desperate, Eleanor realized, dying and desperate to ensure his family was taken care of. A terrible suspicion formed in her mind. What if Montgomery did find them? What if he recognized them from Gabriel's description, realized who they were, and arranged for them to be indentured to Foster? Rebecca finished, horror dawning on her face, keeping them close but under his control. Until Foster died unexpectedly, Hannah added, forcing Montgomery to bid on us at the auction to maintain that control. Only to have Eleanor outbid him, Daniel said, the pieces falling into place. The final insult from Gabriel's family, his widow rescuing his sisters from Montgomery's grasp. Lydia's face had gone deathly pale. He knows who we are, she whispered. He's always known. That's why he... She stopped, unable to continue, her hand moving protectively to her swollen belly. Eleanor felt sick as she realized the implication of Lydia's unfinished sentence. Montgomery's cruelty had extended beyond forcing her to bury the dead. The child she carried was evidence of an even more personal violation. "We'll stop him," Eleanor promised, a cold fury settling in her chest. "For Gabriel, for those soldiers, and for you, Lydia." "How?" Hannah asked, her voice small with fear. "Together," Eleanor replied simply, "as a family." Outside, the Nebraska dusk deepened into night stars appearing one by one in the vast sky. In the distance, a coyote called its lonely cry, echoing across the plains. Inside the cabin, the newly discovered family bent their heads together, planning their defense against the man who had cast a shadow over all their lives. The reckoning was coming. Eleanor could feel it as surely as she could feel the weight of Gabriel's rifle in her hands, the weapon that had nearly ended her life 2 weeks ago, now repurposed for protection, for survival, for justice. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor Reed was fully awake. Eleanor woke before dawn, her body tense with anticipation. Sleep had come in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of Gabriel and shadowed graves. The weight of yesterday's discoveries pressed on her mind: the gold, the bodies, Daniel's identity, Lydia's confession. So many secrets unearthed in a single day. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the sisters who slept behind their curtain. Daniel had taken up position on the porch, insisting on standing guard through the night. Eleanor pulled on her clothes and moved to the hearth, stirring the banked coals to life. The soft glow illuminated the cabin, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor. Her eyes fell on Gabriel's rifle propped in the corner, then moved to the medical texts stacked neatly on the shelf where Hannah had discovered them. Beside them sat the journal with its revelations about Gabriel's knowledge of his sisters. So many fragments of the past suddenly connected in ways she could never have imagined. The cabin door opened softly and Daniel stepped inside, removing his hat. His face showed the weariness of a night without sleep, but his eyes were alert. "All quiet," he reported in a low voice. "No sign of Montgomery or his men." "Yet," Eleanor added grimly. Daniel nodded. "Yet." They had spent the previous evening crafting their plan. Daniel would escort Eleanor and Lydia to town to file the mineral claim and document Lydia's testimony about the graves. Rebecca and Hannah would remain at the homestead, Rebecca armed with Gabriel's rifle and instructions to fire a warning shot if trouble approached. Eleanor poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to Daniel. "When do you think he'll move against us?" "Soon," Daniel replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Montgomery's not a patient man when his interests are threatened. And now he has 2 reasons to want your land: the gold and the evidence of his crimes." "3 reasons," Eleanor corrected softly. "To punish Gabriel's family." Daniel's eyes met hers, acknowledging the truth of her words. "We should leave as soon as it's light. The earlier we reach town, the less chance of an ambush." Eleanor nodded and moved to wake the sisters. Behind the curtain, she found Rebecca, already awake, sitting on the edge of her makeshift bed, plaiting her hair. Lydia and Hannah slept on either side of her, their faces peaceful in repose. "It's time," Eleanor said simply. Rebecca nodded. "I'll wake them." An hour later, with the first pale light of dawn breaking over the eastern horizon, they gathered in the yard. Eleanor had hitched her horse to the small wagon, ready for the journey to town. She checked that the gold-bearing rock was secure in her pocket, along with a careful map of the burial sites drawn from Lydia's descriptions. Rebecca stood straight back. Despite her advanced pregnancy, Gabriel's rifle held comfortably in her hands. Hannah stood beside her, a small packet of medicinal herbs clutched to her chest, remedies she had prepared in case of injury. Lydia was the last to emerge from the cabin, her face pale but determined. She had spent the previous evening recounting everything she remembered about the burials: dates, locations, descriptions of the victims. The telling had exhausted her, but also seemed to lift a weight from her shoulders, as if sharing the burden had diminished its power over her. "Remember," Daniel instructed Rebecca, "fire a warning shot if anyone approaches. Don't wait to see if they're friendly. Then get yourselves into the root cellar and bar the door." Rebecca nodded gravely. "We'll be fine. Just hurry back." Eleanor embraced each of the sisters in turn, the gesture still new and somewhat awkward but sincere. When she came to Lydia, she held the younger woman's gaze. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You can stay here with the others." Lydia shook her head. "I need to do this. For them." She glanced toward the creek where the unmarked graves lay. "And for myself. Eleanor nodded understanding. Sometimes facing the darkness was the only path to light. Daniel helped Lydia into the wagon, then mounted his own horse. With a final wave to Rebecca and Hannah, they set off down the rutted track that led toward town, the rising sun at their backs casting long shadows before them. The journey to Kingston was tense, every creak of the wagon and rustle in the tall grass setting their nerves on edge. They passed the spot where the creek left Eleanor's property, its waters gleaming innocently in the morning light, giving no hint of the secrets it contained. Daniel rode ahead, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Eleanor kept the reins in one hand, her other near the shotgun propped beside her on the wagon seat. Beside her, Lydia sat in silence, her hands folded protectively over her belly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. They were halfway to town when Daniel suddenly raised his hand, signaling them to stop. He sat motionless in his saddle, head tilted as if listening. "What is it?" Eleanor whispered, pulling the wagon to a halt. Daniel pointed to a rise about a quarter-mile to the east. "Riders, 3 of them, moving parallel to us." Eleanor strained her eyes but could see nothing through the tall prairie grass. "Montgomery's men, most likely, keeping their distance for now but watching." Lydia's hand gripped Eleanor's arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. "They know what we're doing," she whispered. "They know I'm going to testify." Daniel turned his horse and rode back to them. "We keep going," he said firmly. "They won't try anything on the open road in broad daylight. Too many witnesses once we get closer to town." Eleanor nodded and flicked the reins, urging the horse forward. The wagon lurched into motion once more, its wooden wheels creaking in protest. As they continued, Eleanor became aware of the riders keeping pace with them, occasionally visible when they crested a rise, then disappearing again into the rolling landscape. "They're herding us," Daniel muttered as they approached a bend in the road where it dipped between 2 small hills. "Like wolves with sheep." Eleanor felt it too, the subtle pressure directing them toward the narrow passage between the hills, where the road was most vulnerable to ambush. She pulled the shotgun onto her lap, no longer bothering with pretense. "Options?" she asked tersely. Daniel considered for a moment. "Cut across country, make straight for his town. It's rougher terrain for the wagon, but it keeps us in the open." Without hesitation, Eleanor turned the wagon off the road, steering the horse directly across the prairie toward the distant silhouette of Kingston. The wagon bounced violently over the uneven ground, forcing Lydia to cling to the seat to avoid being thrown. "They're coming," Daniel warned, looking over his shoulder. Eleanor glanced back to see the 3 riders emerging from behind the hills, now in clear pursuit. They had abandoned any pretense of simply traveling in the same direction. "Faster," Eleanor urged her horse, snapping the reins. The wagon picked up speed, jolting over the rough ground with bone-jarring force. Daniel pulled his revolver and turned his mount to ride alongside them, positioning himself between the wagon and the pursuers. A shot cracked across the prairie, the bullet whistling past them to bury itself in the earth ahead. "Warning shot," Daniel called. "They want us to stop." "Not a chance," Eleanor replied grimly, pushing the horse harder. The town was growing larger on the horizon, close enough now that Eleanor could make out individual buildings. If they could reach the outskirts, the pursuers would have to break off their chase. Even Montgomery wouldn't risk an open attack within sight of witnesses. Another shot rang out closer this time. Daniel returned fire, forcing the riders to scatter temporarily. But they quickly regrouped and continued their pursuit, gaining ground with every passing moment. "They're trying to stop us before we reach town," Lydia said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her white-knuckled grip on the wagon seat. "They won't succeed," Eleanor assured her, though her own heart pounded with fear and exertion. A third shot hit the wagon itself, splintering wood near Eleanor's head. Daniel fired twice more, and one of the pursuers fell from his saddle. The remaining 2 pulled up short, clearly reassessing their strategy now that blood had been drawn. That brief hesitation was all the advantage Eleanor needed. She drove the wagon forward with renewed determination, and minutes later they were passing the first outlying buildings of Kingston. The pursuing riders veered away, unwilling to continue the chase into town. "We made it," Lydia breathed, her shoulders sagging with relief. "For now," Daniel cautioned, holstering his revolver. "But Montgomery will know we're here. We need to move quickly." They proceeded directly to the sheriff's office, drawing curious stares from townspeople as they passed. The wagon was visibly damaged from the pursuit, and all 3 of them bore the dust and strain of their journey. Inside the office, Daniel quickly organized his deputy to stand guard while he accompanied Eleanor and Lydia to file their claims. First to the land office where Eleanor formally registered her mineral claim on the gold found in the creek. Then to the courthouse where Lydia gave her sworn testimony about the unmarked graves and Montgomery's involvement in the deaths of the Union prisoners. The clerk recording Lydia's statement was visibly shaken by her account. "These are serious accusations against a prominent citizen," he said, looking nervously between Lydia and Daniel. "They're the truth," Lydia replied quietly. "I can show you where every grave is located." Daniel placed the tarnished buttons and other evidence they had collected on the clerk's desk. "We have physical proof to support her testimony, and we'll have more once a proper investigation exhumes the remains." The clerk nodded reluctantly. "I'll need to inform Judge Parker." "Do that," Daniel agreed, "but also telegraph the federal marshal in Omaha. These crimes fall under federal jurisdiction given that they involve the murder of Union soldiers." As they left the courthouse, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Their claims were filed, Lydia's testimony recorded. Montgomery could still threaten them, but he could no longer simply seize their land through legal manipulation. "What now?" Lydia asked as they stepped back into the bright midday sun. "Now we get you both back to the homestead," Daniel replied. "It's not safe for you to remain in town." They were walking toward the wagon when Eleanor spotted a familiar figure across the street, Montgomery himself standing outside his bank, watching them with cold calculation in his eyes. Beside him stood Judge Parker, engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation. Daniel followed her gaze. "He knows," he said softly. "Look at his face. He knows what we've done." Eleanor met Montgomery's stare, directly refusing to show fear. After a moment, it was Montgomery who broke the contact, turning back to the judge with a dismissive gesture. "He'll move against us tonight," Daniel predicted as they continued toward the wagon. "With everything we've set in motion today, he can't afford to wait." Eleanor nodded, her jaw set in determination. "Then we'll be ready for him." The return journey to the homestead was tense but uneventful. There was no sign of the riders who had pursued them earlier, though Daniel remained vigilant, constantly scanning the horizon for threats. As they crested the final hill and the homestead came into view, Eleanor felt a surge of relief at the sight of smoke rising peacefully from the cabin's chimney. Rebecca stood on the porch, rifle in hand, clearly having kept watch for their return. "Any trouble?" Daniel called as they approached. Rebecca shook her head. "All quiet. Hannah's been preparing medicines just in case." She looked at their faces, reading the tension there. "You had problems." "Riders," Eleanor replied tersely, climbing down from the wagon. "They tried to stop us reaching town." Inside the cabin, over mugs of hot coffee, they recounted the morning's events. The pursuit, filing the claims, Montgomery's cold stare outside the bank. "So it's done," Hannah said when they finished. "The claims are filed." "The legal part is done," Daniel corrected. "But Montgomery won't limit himself to legal means now. He'll come for the land directly." "Tonight," Eleanor added. "Almost certainly tonight." The sisters exchanged glances, fear mingling with determination in their expressions. "What do we do?" Lydia asked. Daniel stood and moved to the window, looking out at the afternoon sun. "We prepare, fortify the cabin, establish defensive positions, create a safe space for you three in the root cellar." "Four," Rebecca corrected, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "We're all expecting." Daniel's expression softened momentarily. "Of course, forgive me." For the next several hours, they worked to transform the homestead into a defensive position. Daniel and Eleanor moved furniture to create barricades near the windows and doors. They filled buckets with water, both for drinking and for dousing potential fires. Hannah prepared bandages and medicinal poultices for treating wounds. Rebecca, despite her pregnancy, proved invaluable in planning their defense. Her carpenter father had taught her not just how to use tools, but how to think strategically about structures. "The barn roof," she suggested, pointing from the cabin window. "It offers a clear view of the approach from the south. Someone positioned there could see riders coming from a half-mile away." Daniel nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. I'll take that position when the time comes." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, and Eleanor gathered everyone in the cabin for a final review of their plan. The sisters would shelter in the root cellar beneath the cabin floor if fighting broke out, with Rebecca armed to defend the entrance if necessary. Daniel would take the high position in the barn loft while Eleanor would defend the cabin itself. "Once it's fully dark, I want you three in the cellar," Daniel instructed. "Don't come out unless one of us calls for you, no matter what you hear." "What about you?" Hannah asked, her young face creased with worry. "I'll be fine," Daniel assured her with a confidence Eleanor suspected he didn't entirely feel. "I've survived worse." As twilight deepened into dusk, Eleanor stood on the porch with Daniel watching the western sky fade from gold to purple to deep blue. Stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of light in the vast Nebraska heavens. "Beautiful night," Daniel observed quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Too beautiful for killing." "Some would say that's the best kind of night to die," Daniel replied. "Under an open sky with the stars to guide you home." The words stirred something in Eleanor's memory. Gabriel had said something similar once during the war, when they had lain side by side on a hospital cot, watching the stars through a hole in the tent roof. "Gabriel would have been proud of you," she said suddenly, "of how you've watched over me all these years." Daniel's eyes glistened in the fading light. "I promised him I would. Brothers keep their promises." "After tonight," Eleanor said, "whatever happens, I want you to be part of this family openly. No more secrets, no more Sheriff Cooper. Just Daniel Reed." Daniel smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "I'd like that." The moment was interrupted by the soft sound of hoof beats in the distance. Daniel's expression immediately hardened as he turned toward the sound. "They're coming," he said grimly, "from the south as we expected." Eleanor nodded, her hand moving to the shotgun at her side. "How many?" Daniel strained his eyes in the growing darkness. "Can't tell yet. At least 4, maybe more. Montgomery with them. I'd bet on his bet on it. He'd want to see this finished personally." Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Get the sisters to the cellar. I'll take position in the cabin. You head for the barn loft." Daniel hesitated, then suddenly pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace. "Be careful, sister," he murmured before releasing her and hurrying inside to help the sisters to safety. Eleanor remained on the porch for a moment longer, listening to the approaching riders. 5 years ago, she had been ready to die, the rifle pressed beneath her chin, her goodbye letter to Gabriel carefully composed. Now she found herself fiercely determined to live, to protect the family she had found, to see justice done. She entered the cabin to find Daniel already helping the sisters through the trap door to the root cellar. Rebecca stood at the entrance, Gabriel's rifle clutched in her hands, her expression resolute despite the fear evident in her eyes. "Remember," Eleanor told her, "stay hidden unless they breach the cabin. Your first responsibility is to protect Lydia and Hannah." Rebecca nodded. "We'll be ready." With a final glance at her sisters-in-law, Eleanor closed and secured the trap door, then positioned herself at the front window. Through the glass, she could see Daniel making his way cautiously to the barn, keeping to the shadows. The riders were closer now, their outlines visible against the darkening sky. Eleanor counted 6 of them, moving slowly but deliberately toward the homestead. They stopped just beyond effective rifle range, gathering in a tight group as if conferring. After a moment, one rider separated from the others and approached alone. Even in the dim light, Eleanor recognized Montgomery's straight-back posture and distinctive hat. He stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. "Mrs. Reed," he called, his southern accent carrying clearly in the still evening air. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Eleanor didn't respond, keeping her position beside the window rather than showing herself on the porch. "I know you're in there," Montgomery continued. "You and Sheriff Cooper, or should I say Daniel Reed. Yes, I know who he really is. I know all about the happy family reunion you have been having." Still, Eleanor remained silent, though her heart raced at the confirmation that Montgomery knew Daniel's true identity. "I'm offering you a chance to resolve this peacefully," Montgomery called after a pause. "Sign over the mineral rights to the creek, and we'll forget about today's unpleasantness in town." When there was no response, Montgomery's voice hardened. "I also want the girl, Lydia. She has some unfinished business with me." At this, Eleanor felt a surge of protective rage. She moved to the door and called through it without opening it. "There's nothing to discuss, Colonel. The mineral claim is filed. The authorities know about the graves. It's over." Montgomery laughed, the sound chilling in its genuine amusement. "My dear Mrs. Reed, nothing is over until I say it's over. Those claims can be lost. Testimonies can be discredited. Witnesses can disappear." "Not this time," Eleanor replied firmly. "Leave my property now, or I'll consider this trespassing and act accordingly." "You're outnumbered, Mrs. Reed, you and the sheriff against 6 experienced men. Poor odds even for a woman desperate enough to buy 3 pregnant indentures at auction. Eleanor didn't reply. She moved back to the window, checking that her shotgun was loaded and ready. Through the glass, she could just make out Daniel's position in the barn loft, the faint gleam of his revolver visible in the growing darkness. Outside, Montgomery had apparently tired of the one-sided conversation. He wheeled his horse around and rejoined his men. After a brief consultation, they spread out encircling the homestead. 2 men approached the barn, while 3 others moved toward the cabin from different directions. Montgomery himself remained at a distance watching. The first shot came from the barn loft, Daniel firing at one of the men approaching his position. The man fell, but his companion returned fire, forcing Daniel to duck back out of sight. The night erupted into chaos. Shots came from multiple directions, bullets thudding into the cabin's log walls or whistling through windows. Eleanor returned fire carefully, aiming at muzzle flashes in the darkness. She heard glass break at the back of the cabin, followed by the unmistakable whoosh of flames igniting. Moving quickly, she grabbed one of the prepared water buckets and doused the burning rag that had been thrown through the window, extinguishing the fire before it could spread. Outside, one of Montgomery's men had reached the porch. Eleanor heard his boots on the wooden planks, then the creak of the door handle as he tested it. Finding it barred, he moved to the window. Eleanor waited until his silhouette appeared against the glass, then fired both barrels of the shotgun. The window shattered outward, and the man dropped from view with a strangled cry. She reloaded quickly, her hands steady despite the danger. From the barn came the continued exchange of gunfire, telling her that Daniel was still holding his position. A new sound caught her attention, breaking glass from the bedroom window at the rear of the cabin. Eleanor moved swiftly through the darkened interior, relying on her intimate knowledge of the space. She reached the bedroom just as a large figure was climbing through the broken window. She fired without hesitation. The intruder staggered but didn't fall, returning fire as he lunged forward. Eleanor felt a searing pain across her upper arm as a bullet grazed her, but she maintained her grip on the shotgun, swinging it like a club when the man came within reach. The wooden stock connected with his head with a sickening crack, and he collapsed to the floor. Breathing heavily, Eleanor checked that the man wasn't getting up, then moved back to the main room. Through the front window, she could see that the barn was now fully engulfed in flames, casting a hellish glow over the homestead. Her heart seized with fear for Daniel. Had he escaped the fire, or was he trapped in the burning structure? A movement outside caught her eye, a figure running from the blazing barn toward the cabin. Even in the chaotic light of the fire, she recognized Daniel's distinctive gait. He was alive, though he appeared to be favoring one leg. Eleanor opened the door just enough to allow him inside, then quickly barred it again behind him. "Are you hurt?" she asked, noting the blood staining his left trouser leg. "Just a graze," he replied grimly. "The barn's lost. They set it alight from the rear while keeping me pinned down with gunfire." He looked around the cabin. The sisters. Still in the cellar, 2 men tried to breach the cabin. One's down on the porch, the other in the bedroom. Daniel nodded, checking his revolver. "That leaves 3 outside, including Montgomery." A voice called from the darkness beyond the burning barn. "Cooper Reed, whatever you call yourself, you're running out of options." Daniel moved to the window, staying carefully to one side to avoid presenting a target. "They're regrouping," he reported, using the fire for light. Eleanor joined him, peering cautiously through the broken glass. She could see 3 figures silhouetted against the flames, Montgomery and 2 others all armed. "They'll rush us," Daniel predicted. "Try to overwhelm us with numbers." Eleanor calculated swiftly. She had 4 shells left for the shotgun. Daniel's revolver likely held 2 or 3 rounds, not enough for a prolonged firefight. "The root cellar," she decided. "We fall back there, barricade ourselves in with the sisters." Daniel nodded grimly. "It's our best option. I'll cover you while you get the trapdoor open." Eleanor moved to the center of the cabin floor and began pulling back the rug that concealed the trapdoor. As she worked, a new sound reached them, horses approaching at a gallop, not from the direction of Montgomery's men, but from the road. "More riders," Daniel warned it, moving to check the eastern window. Eleanor's heart sank. Reinforcements from Montgomery would seal their fate. But Daniel's expression suddenly transformed from grim resignation to cautious hope. "It's not Montgomery's men," he reported. "It looks like, my God, it's a cavalry patrol." Eleanor joined him at the window. In the light cast by the burning barn, she could make out a column of uniformed soldiers approaching at speed, led by an officer whose bearings suggested authority. The telegram to Omaha, she realized. They responded. Outside Montgomery and his remaining men had also spotted the approaching cavalry. One of them immediately broke for the darkness, fleeing toward the creek. The other raised his hands in surrender. Montgomery himself remained motionless for a long moment, then suddenly spurred his horse toward the cabin, revolver raised. "He's coming for us," Daniel warned, taking aim through the broken window. But before he could fire, the trap door burst open from below. Rebecca emerged, Gabriel's rifle in her hands. In one fluid motion, she raised the weapon, sighted along the barrel, and fired. Montgomery jerked in his saddle, then toppled sideways, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. "I told you I knew how to shoot," Rebecca said quietly, lowering the rifle. Eleanor stared at her in astonishment. "You were supposed to stay hidden." "I heard the cavalry coming," Rebecca replied simply. "Thought you might need an extra gun." The cabin door shuddered under a heavy blow, then swung open to reveal the cavalry officer, his revolver drawn. He took in the scene with a quick professional glance. Eleanor, with her shotgun, Daniel bleeding but upright, Rebecca with the rifle, the trapdoor opened to reveal Lydia and Hannah peering up from below. "Sheriff Cooper," the officer asked, his gaze settling on Daniel. Daniel nodded. "Captain, your timing is impeccable. We received your telegram about illegal mining claims, impossible military graves," the captain replied. "Appears we arrived in the middle of something more immediate. Colonel Montgomery objected to our filing certain claims in town today," Daniel explained. "He brought some friends to discuss the matter." The captain's eyes narrowed. "Montgomery, Ezra Montgomery." "The same," Daniel confirmed. "Interesting," the captain said, his tone suggesting more than casual interest. "We've had inquiries about him from the War Department. Something about unresolved allegations from during the conflict." "Those allegations just got considerably less unresolved," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the creek. "We have evidence and a witness." The captain followed her gaze, then nodded briskly. "We'll need statements from all of you, and I'll post men here tonight for your protection." As the officer went to organize his men, Eleanor sank into a chair, the events of the night catching up with her. Her arm throbbed where the bullet had grazed it, and every muscle ached with tension and exertion. Rebecca helped Lydia and Hannah from the root cellar, the three sisters clinging to each other in relief and exhaustion. Daniel limped to Eleanor's side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. Eleanor looked up at him, then at the sisters, her family, Gabriel's family survivors all. "Not over," she corrected. "Just beginning." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the Nebraska sky a vast blue canopy stretching from horizon to horizon. Eleanor stood on the porch watching as the cavalry patrol prepared to depart. The bodies of Montgomery and his men had been loaded onto wagons covered with canvas sheets for the journey to town. The barn was a blackened ruin, but the cabin had survived with minimal damage. The captain had left 2 soldiers behind to guard the homestead until a formal investigation of the graves could be conducted. Daniel stood beside Eleanor, his injured leg properly bandaged thanks to Hannah's herbal poultices and Eleanor's medical knowledge. The sisters sat on the porch steps, their faces showing the strain of the night's events, but also a new serenity, as if a shadow had lifted from their lives. "What happens now?" Hannah asked, voicing the question in all their minds. "Now," Eleanor replied, "we rebuild the barn first, then we see what comes of the gold claim." "And Montgomery's crimes?" Lydia asked quietly. "The captain assured me they'll conduct a full investigation," Daniel said. "With your testimony and the physical evidence, they'll be able to identify the victims and notify their families. They'll finally have proper burials." Lydia nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "They deserve that." Eleanor moved to sit beside her, taking the younger woman's hand. "You helped make that possible. You carried that burden alone for so long, but you didn't break." "I almost did," Lydia admitted, "many times," Zay says. "But you didn't," Rebecca said firmly, "and you survived. We all did." Eleanor looked out across the homestead, seeing it with new eyes. 5 years ago, she had arrived here with Gabriel, full of hope for their future. Then had come the fever, his death, the loss of their unborn child, and the long gray years of grief. Now, against all odds, life had returned to this place. The sisters with their impending births, Daniel with his steady presence. Even the land itself seemed more vibrant, as if responding to the renewed purpose of its inhabitants. Gabriel would have loved this, she thought. His fragmented family brought together, the blight of Montgomery's evil finally expunged justice within reach for the men who had died under his cruelty. I was thinking, Daniel said, breaking into her thoughts, the gold claim will need managing. And the town could use a new deputy, someone who knows the law and can be trusted to uphold it fairly. Are you offering me a job, Sheriff? Eleanor asked, the faintest smile touching her lips. More like a partnership, Daniel replied. The Reed family business. I like the sound of that, Rebecca said. Though we'll need someone to manage the homestead while you're both in town. And someone to help with the births, Hannah added. They'll be coming soon. And someone to establish that medical practice you've been considering, Lydia said to Eleanor. With Hannah's herbs and your training, this territory could use proper healers. Eleanor looked at each of them in turn, these people who had entered her life just when she had been ready to leave it. Family, purpose, future, things she had thought forever lost to her. We have time, she said. Time to decide. Time to build. Time to heal. Daniel nodded toward the horizon where the first signs of a thunderstorm were gathering in the distance. Storm coming, he observed. Let it come, Eleanor replied, a new strength in her voice. We've weathered worse. As if in response, the child within Rebecca's womb kicked a visible movement beneath her dress that drew all their attention. Rebecca placed her hand over the spot, a look of wonder crossing her face despite the many times she had felt the sensation before. Gabriel's family, she murmured. The next generation. Eleanor reached out tentatively, and Rebecca guided her hand to feel the movement of the child. The simple touch connected them past and future loss and renewal, death and life, continuing its relentless, miraculous cycle. In that moment, with the vast Nebraska sky above them and the earth solid beneath their feet, Eleanor Reed finally understood what Gabriel had seen in this wild, beautiful land. Not just a place to escape the horrors of war, but a place to build something new from the ashes of the old. A place where echoes of the past could blend with the voices of the future, creating a harmony all their own. The storm on the horizon moved closer, bringing the scent of rain on the wind. But they remained on the porch, this newfound family, watching its approach without fear. They had survived Montgomery's attack just as they had survived all the losses and hardships that had come before. They would survive this storm too, and all the storms to come. Together. 3 months later, Eleanor stood on the same porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The rebuilt barn stood sturdy and weather-tight, its fresh-cut timber still fragrant in the warm summer air. Beside it, the chicken coop had doubled in size, housing a flock that provided eggs enough to sell in town each week. From inside the cabin came the sound of a baby's cry, quickly soothed by a gentle voice. Lydia appeared in the doorway, a small bundle cradled in her arms. He's settled now, she said, her face soft with new motherhood. Just wanted to be held. Eleanor smiled. Bring him here. Let him feel the breeze. Lydia joined her on the porch, carefully positioning her son, barely 2 weeks old, so the fresh air could caress his tiny face. The infant's eyes, still the unfocused blue of newborns, blinked up at the vast Nebraska sky. He looks more like you every day, Eleanor observed. Lydia beamed with pride. Rebecca says he has the Reed eyes, though, the family trait. Inside, Rebecca's daughter, born first among the 3 babies just a month earlier, slept peacefully in the cradle Gabriel had built for their own child who never arrived. Hannah's time was near. Her son or daughter would complete the trio of new lives that had transformed the homestead. The sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. Daniel appeared around the bend in the road, raising his hand in greeting as he neared the cabin. Uncle Daniel is here, Lydia told her son, though the infant showed no recognition of either the words or the approaching visitor. Daniel had become a daily presence at the homestead in the months since Montgomery's death. He had supervised the barn raising, bringing men from town to help with the heavy work. He had arranged for a mining expert to assess the gold deposit in the creek, which had proven modest but profitable enough to secure their future. Most importantly, he had become family, the uncle who told stories of Gabriel, who helped Rebecca improve her shooting, who carved tiny wooden animals for the babies. Ladies, Daniel called as he climbed down from the wagon. Beautiful afternoon. Any news from town? Eleanor asked as he joined them on the porch. Daniel nodded. The last of the bodies has been identified. All 12 men have been claimed by their families. They'll be reburied next week in the military cemetery at Fort Kearney with full honors. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief, not sorrow. They're going home, she whispered. Thanks to you, Daniel said gently. Your testimony gave them back their names, their dignity. He produced a letter from his pocket. This came for you, Eleanor, from the governor's office. Eleanor set aside her cup of tea to accept the envelope. Inside was a formal document confirming her mineral rights and granting an additional parcel of land adjacent to her property as compensation for damages suffered during Montgomery's attack. More land, she mused, passing the letter to Lydia. Gabriel always wanted to expand. Speaking of expansion, Daniel said with a smile, I've been thinking about that plot next to mine in town. It would make a fine location for a proper doctor's office. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. A doctor's office or a nurse's practice? A healing place, Daniel amended. Kingston's growing. People need medical care beyond what old Dr. Phillips can provide with his shaky hands and outdated methods. It wasn't the first time Daniel had suggested Eleanor return to medical work. Since the babies had begun arriving, she had found herself using her long-dormant skills first with Rebecca's difficult delivery, then with Lydia's smoother one. The satisfaction of bringing new life into the world had awakened something within her, a sense of purpose she had thought died with Gabriel. I'll consider it, she said as she had each time before. But this time she meant it. The homestead was thriving under their collective care. The gold from the creek provided financial security, and the baby's Gabriel's legacy in more ways than one ensured the Reed name would continue. Perhaps it was time to expand her horizons beyond these acres that had been both prison and sanctuary for so long. As if sensing her thoughts, Rebecca emerged from the cabin with her daughter in her arms. Hannah followed, one hand supporting her heavily pregnant belly as she eased herself onto a porch chair. I heard a wagon, Rebecca said, nodding a greeting to Daniel. Any news about the soldiers? Daniel repeated the information about the identified remains to general satisfaction. Good, Rebecca said firmly. Let them rest in peace. They sat together as the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the homestead. The babies dozed in their mother's arms. Daniel recounted town gossip. Eleanor found herself observing them all with a sense of wonder. This family that had formed from fragments, this home that had transformed from a shrine to the past into a cradle for the future. 5 years ago, she had been prepared to end her life, convinced that grief was all that remained for her. Now, as evening painted the Nebraska sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold, Eleanor Reed looked at the faces of her family and saw not endings but beginnings. Gabriel had wanted roots, had dreamed of children running across these plains. In his absence, his dream had taken an unexpected form. Half-sisters, he never knew a half-brother who honored his memory, a wife who had found her way back to the living, and babies, 3 small lives who would grow up hearing stories of the brave Union lieutenant who had indirectly brought them all together. It wasn't the future, sure, Eleanor had planned. It was better, richer, more complex, filled with the kind of love that grows not from obligation, but from choice, from facing darkness together and emerging into light. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor looked at her family and finally allowed herself to think the words that had been forming in her heart for months. This is enough. This is everything. And for the first time in years, she believed it.